Welcome to the inaugural Kigali Global Dialogue, a unique South-to-South discussion on issues that are common to all of us. And we are also looking at how we can deepen this partnership in Africa, where we understand each other's problems and try and find solutions, learning from each other's past, shared cultures and histories. Today we are discussing a very exciting discussion on the partnership between India and Japan, two Asian giants who've historically shared a very close relationship, and how they could now combine strengths, learnings, and probably investments to look at partnering Africa across the continent and see how we can deepen our relationship between these two Asian giants and emerging Africa. And I have an excellent panel to discuss that with me today. I have Ambassador Miyashita. He is the Japanese ambassador in Rwanda. I have Professor Renu Modi. She is with the Center for African Studies at the University of Mumbai in India. And I have Shihoko Goto. She is the Deputy Director at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And they will be sharing their thoughts not only on the relationship between India and Japan and how it has evolved over the last few years, but how they could now look at Africa as another leg of this excellent historical relationship. With that, Ambassador, I'd like to come to you.
Yes.
India and Japan have traditionally been very good allies and have shared a deep cultural, economic, and historical past. I remember post-war, when the trials were taking place, it was an Indian judge who sat in those trials and actually spoke up about certain kind of rights for defendants, etc., which became law in international law much later. And he's probably one of those few people to whom a shrine has been built in Japan. So that's the kind of relationship. And today we now see the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Prime Minister Narendra Modi share a rare personal bond, which is very, very rare to see in international relations.
Yes.
So how do you view the India and Japan relations, and where can they work together in a bountiful continent like Africa?
Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure to be invited here. Today I'm going to concentrate on government relations between Japan and India. As you said, we have very friendly relations, especially in the past few years. The Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Modi, they met 12 times in a very short time. And the last visit of the Prime Minister Modi to Japan, the two heads of government signed the joint statement. This is a very important political basis. And this political basis says the India and Japan should work together in Africa, cooperation to Africa. And based on this agreement, this year in May, the Transform Africa Summit was held here in Kigali. Japanese Ministry of Telecommunication and Indian Ministry of Telecommunication. They had a joint session here in Kigali, and they have now exploring their cooperation with African countries. So in this way, Japan, India were historically very, very good, but in the future, I think our relation will be much strengthened, much deepened.
Ambassador, could you tell us what kind of cooperation? I mean, when you look at, say, telecom is in a way transforming societies. If you have a good telecom foundation, that could be the basis for a good ICT infrastructure, etc. So what kind of cooperation are we looking at?
I think ICT is not the goal, not the aim. We have to use ICT to develop our country to solve the problems of Africa. And from this point of view, I think Rwanda, Japan and India has both strong point and weak points. Japan maybe smart city designing or the disaster control. This kind of area is our strength, and we can implement these strengths in Africa together with India. But India has also very strong point. You have a very traditional long economic relations. Many Indians are very active in this continent, and you have a very deep involved in African continent. So I think if Japan and India work together, so Japan can get the synergy effect from this cooperation. So Japan, India, Africa can develop each other, and this will be a win-win-win game. Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Modi, if I were to come to you, there are two things. One, if we hear what the Ambassador said, that there has been a traditional relationship and there are strengths and weaknesses on both sides, but they are complementary in many ways, that they could therefore be of great service to helping Africa also address many of its challenges which some of these countries have faced earlier. So where do you think are the similarities? And my second question is, where do you see China in this whole matrix?
Okay, since we have a synergy in our, and we have a common framework of thinking based on the global liberal democratic order, which is kind of emblematized in the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor Vision document that was unveiled just last year at Gandhinagar in 2017. And in that document, they are talking about what they want to do synergetically in Africa, and that is the development cooperation, increasing connectivities. And when you talk about, just you mentioned the word Japan in Africa, the first thing they will say is either Toyota or quality infrastructure. So quality infrastructure, increased digital connectivities, as Ambassador already said. And today at the meeting, we were talking about drone technologies for health, AI, the fourth industrial revolution. And Japan, as we know, is a leader in these agendas. And second, we are talking of capacity and skill building. That has been the niche area and the USP of India forever, since 1964 when we launched the ITEC program. And second, India, our Prime Minister's statement, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, is the same as what we are talking about, people-centered development, that is enshrined in the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. Now, where can they work together is that because Japan, in 2006, Japan's ODA to Africa was at its peak. But both India and Africa being liberal democracies, they have their domestic compulsions. They've had their ups and downs in their engagement with Africa. We are accountable to our own democracies, to our people. So Japan has had to deal with disasters, with the Fukushima disaster. India has its own developmental challenges. So within these frameworks, we have worked in other countries and development cooperation. Japan has limited outreach in some countries in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. India has access to over 40 countries through its diaspora, through its own historical, relations since antiquity. And therefore, they can synergize where Japan has technology and capacity. India has the skills, the people, and it can move to other countries where Japan has not had an access. And they have a common framework of thinking, and very rightly, Abe and Modi believe that they believe the oceans as an international public good and not as a preserve of any one country. And so they are talking about, through this Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, what has come is that there's a huge arc of growth and prosperity. You can imagine it straddles the two oceans, the Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean. It encompasses 54 countries in Africa, Japan, of course, 8 countries in South Asia, including India, 11 countries in Southeast Asia, and 14 countries of the Oceania.
So where do you think does China figure in this matrix?
China figures
because China is equally very keen on coming into Africa, but there is a difference in the way China does business and the way India and Japan. So where do you think?
Okay. Let's see what's in it for Africa in this entire Asia-Africa Growth Corridor or China's engagement in Africa. Now, in this arena of development cooperation, the traditional donors have kind of backed out or slowed down given their compulsions in Europe. And China, with the decline in prices in commodity in Africa and the slowing down of economic growth in China, Africa cannot depend on a single partner. So if it has broad-based, its choice of partners, it's to the advantage of Africa, one. Second, China definitely has offered a lot to Africa in terms of its big pocket, its infrastructure development, but that has not been without its challenges. Now you see the case of Sri Lanka, other countries in Africa, which are debt-laden because nobody even knew about the funding mechanisms. This is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, as espoused, is based on the liberal international norms of good governance, fairness, transparency, and accountability. That includes funding. So Prime Minister Abe very openly stated that the funding for this Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and the quality infrastructure and the oceanic connectivity that they're talking about will be a broad-based structure. So governments, private sector, international stakeholders such as the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank will be partners. And when there are so many partners, there cannot be secrecy shrouded in the way of funding.
It is transparent.
It is transparent. Yes.
Transparency by design.
Yes, and it is very accountable to the people that it is trying to reach out.
And also multi-stakeholder.
Absolutely.
Unlike a uni-stakeholder.
Correct. And when there is multi-stakeholder, including the United Nations, for example, TICAD 6, which was held in Nairobi, had UNDP as a partner. So by its very design, Japan and India are going out in a multi-stakeholder style of development cooperation in Africa because they've seen the pitfalls of these bilateral kind of development cooperation. So fairness, good governance, empowerment of people, and it is for Africa to decide their own agenda. It's not demand-laden, it's not in return for stadium diplomacy, or it's not in return for, you pay your debt through oil. That is not the modality.
So those are fairly interesting and, shall we say, fighting words from Professor Modi. And I'll come to you. You've been an award-winning journalist, you've been a scholar, and you've been looking at the Indo-Pacific, and you've been looking at the growth between India and Japan. And now you're seeing that Africa is also emerging as a pillar. So within that matrix, how do you see this relationship growing, and where do you see it leading into?
Yeah. Well, if we take a step back, we are facing a world of great uncertainty and a lot of economic risks, but also security risks as well. We're seeing a lot of barriers being put up. That's most notable in the trade front. And so there are a lot of negatives in the world, and this is not simply an issue that is confronting developing or emerging markets, but it's also a challenge that industrialized countries like Japan is facing as well. Professor Modi talked about the growth corridor and what it has achieved and what it can achieve. If we look a little bit more broadly, if we look, for instance, at the Indo-Pacific strategy or the free and open Indo-Pacific agenda that has been put forward by some of the leading countries in the Asia-Pacific, we see that there is also a great desire to reconsider some of the rules that have prevailed in the 20th century and take a multilateral approach, and at the same time have a recommitted effort to preserve what has worked in the past. And so when we look at post-war reconstruction, we see that for Japan, growing out of the rubbles of World War II, adhering to the rule of law and to a coherent playbook of how to engage economically, politically, militarily, that has worked not just in the favor of Japan, but also for countries across Asia and indeed the world. And when we look at that, there is a great deal of demand for something that the Indo-Pacific strategy is espousing. What does that mean? That means multilateral approach to some of the common agendas that we're facing. The first one, of course, is about this challenge to the international liberal order and questioning the status quo. This is really talking about fairness, transparency, free markets, and it's also tolerance. It's a system that allows governments of different stages of development to come together in a common understanding of the rules that they would like to adhere to. And it also does not espouse one way of governance either. So you can have different government systems working within the same framework. And as we look to Africa and what Africa wants in the future, it wants an Africa growth strategy for and by African nations. Whilst there is no component that looks into Africa with the Indo-Pacific strategy at the moment, we should bear in mind that when Japan actually first initiated this plan under Prime Minister Abe, he was very ambitious in not only outlining it to be a framework for the Asia-Pacific, but also for Africa as well. And there is that great potential, and I believe that Japan, together with India, could really move forward in the strategy and to bring that forward as well. I do want to go back to your question to Professor Modi about the China challenge. Now, the allure of Africa is really apparent. It is, of course, rich in natural resources, but from like Japan's perspective, it's also a dynamic demographic. It's very young, it's very exuberant, it has a great future ahead of it. And so there are many reasons why the African markets are very attractive and they provide a great deal of potential. And now China has been very effective in promoting a lot of investments that have been win-win for both Africa and for China as well. But at the same time, the demands of Africa are great, but it's also not just in the hardware. It's not just about infrastructure development. We take the example of Rwanda, for instance. It wants to move into the competitive 21st century. What does that mean? It does want to focus on things like information technology. That will require not just human capacity building, good education, but it's also an issue of data security. It's really about privacy. These are issues that African countries may not necessarily share with China, but they are issues that perhaps they share more with Japan or indeed India. So as we move forward, the Indo-Pacific strategy really can provide a roadmap for Africa together with India and Japan to follow.
We've already seen China looking at building a naval base
Right.
far from its shores.
Right.
So there is a military component to any strategy. And we've also seen how the talk about a quad with the Americans and the Australians. And we've also seen India and Japan regularly exercise their navies together and have built jointmanship between the two navies. So when you look at all this, there is a large military component which is almost a part of this greater strategy. How would you view some of this?
I would say that yes, there is a big security component to it. And as we talk about the shifts in economic dynamics, there's a tremendous shift in security issues as well. Not necessarily just in alliances, but also in the buildup of trust between countries as well. Long established military alliances between traditional allies are being reconsidered or being challenged. And so in that respect, the fact that China is moving into Africa militarily is something that should be perceived as a threat to global stability as well. Let us also bear in mind that China has been very aggressive in its territorial expansion efforts, not just in the South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea as well. So with that, there is a need to bear in mind some of the ultimate ambitions that China has when it actually provides development assistance or when it does provide security reassurances to the Africa region.
Ambassador, my final question to
Yes.
you. You know, you've been here, you've lived in this region and you've served here. You know what are the needs that African countries have. So if I were to look at it as an investor, as somebody who's looking for business opportunities, what would be the advice you would give in terms of the India-Japan matrix, and what kind of advantages can this partnership offer to future investors and institutional people who would like to come in and look at Africa as a viable market?
Okay, thank you very much. It is very interesting to observe the last 25 years TCAD process. The TCAD process started in 1993. At that time, for the first time TCAD meeting, many African countries asked ODA from Japan. That was the main issue. But in years to come, this has been changed. Africa wants investment, more trade, not so much ODA. So this is a trend, and this year we are going to host TCAD 7 in Yokohama in August. The main pillar will be business promotion in Africa. So the world has changed, and Africa has changed. And Japan would like to support these African wishes. So many business delegations from Japan are visiting African continent every year.
And last year to Rwanda, around 60 Japanese businessmen visited here. So this follows, this continues. So I think the interest is there. But the need is that they were still cautious about coming here to invest. They are very scared about the risks of this continent. So I think it's better to have Indian counterparts to work with. Because you have, as I said, a long history with this continent. You have many experiences with the businessmen in Africa. So I think one of my advices is that why don't you have an Indian counterpart to come to Africa for your investment and for your trade? So maybe this is the way that we are now seeking for. Well, in the past, the ODA was just the target, but now the things are quite different. And coming to the maritime security issue, it is so for Japan is an island country. We have 4 big islands and 3,000 small islands. So the security of maritime security is very crucial for us. So and for you have also you need a maritime security India. So I think this is another area where we can cooperate together. Because we need maritime security, you need maritime security, Africa needs maritime security. So this is of course a rule of law, but I think we need some strategic way to maintain the peace in the maritime on the sea, oceans security. So I think we need some more cooperation in this field. So this is so to speak, one of my comments to my dear colleagues' comments. Thank you.
So with that, we have a wrap. As my esteemed panelists have said, the India-Japan partnership can bring a lot of stability and can also provide a framework which is based on solid democratic principles and prioritizes what Africa needs rather than the strategic interests of either India or Japan. And with that, I would like to thank my esteemed colleagues. Thank you so much for your insights, and it was a pleasure talking to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.